peace agreement is very likely on the horizon. Today, Trump held a cabinet meeting to fully assess and decide whether or not to go through with this and where exactly the difficulties of this agreement lie. That's the first topic we're bringing you today. Last night, the Texas primaries wrapped up. The Trump camp scored another big win. Not just a big win, but a clean sweep. The Republican Party is slowly turning into what people are calling the Trump Republican Party. So what's really going on, and what kind of impact will this have on the future of American politics? And then there's the news that Musk's SpaceX is about to go public. At a critical moment, the U.S. military, quote-unquote, got taken for a ride by Musk. If this ride goes through, it will make a huge contribution to SpaceX's IPO at this crucial time. So let's watch what happens on June 22nd. This could be the biggest IPO in American and even global history. Also, Trump is about to undergo a physical exam. Just how healthy is the former president? He's challenging what we know about medical science. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to Good Morning America, brought to you by Fang Wen. Hello to all our viewers on YouTube and listeners tuning in to Sound of Hope Silicon Valley FM 96.1. If this is your first time joining us, please subscribe and become part of our community. That way, you'll be the first to get important news and in-depth analysis every time we update our show. And to our longtime friends, please help us share the program so that more Chinese speakers who care about current events can see the world from a different perspective. For those of you who aren't sure how to subscribe, all you need is a Gmail account, right? With a Gmail account, you can log into YouTube, and then you'll be able to subscribe, leave comments, and so on. All right, let's get straight to the point. The U.S.-Iran agreement is said to be close to completion. What's going on with that? President Trump, on Wednesday, today, he's going to hold a meeting with senior advisors at the White House. In fact, the meeting's probably already happening. Actually, it's not just with senior advisors, it's a cabinet meeting. So what are they discussing? Well, there are a lot of things on the table. This and that, all sorts of topics. In short, they're talking about the recent achievements of the administration, including economic and small business policies, the progress of the anti-fraud task force, and the latest updates on foreign policy. All of that is true. However, the New York Post pointed out that the most important topic of this meeting is whether to make a decision on implementing the Iran nuclear agreement, or the Iran peace agreement. That's really the main focus of this meeting. So originally, this time, they were supposed to go to Camp David for the meeting. You know, there's something special about holding a meeting at Camp David. There's a lot to it. As everyone knows, since Trump took office for his second term, he's already held 11 cabinet meetings, all of them at the White House. But originally, today's meeting was supposed to be at Camp David. We know Camp David is a retreat about 100 kilometers from the White House, up in the mountains. So in 1942, President Roosevelt chose it as the Presidential Mountain Retreat. At that time, he called it Shangri-La, which means a place beyond the world. Very beautiful. Later, after Roosevelt, President Eisenhower would go there once every 2 months. But Trump only went there once in his first 16 months in office. So why did he want to move this cabinet meeting, which had never been held outside the White House before, to Camp David this time? There's a reason behind it. I was all ready to explain it to everyone, but then he changed his mind and said, never mind, the weather's bad, let's just hold it at the White House. So we'll put this topic aside for now, and I'll talk about the story behind Camp David another time when we have a chance. All right, so it's expected that all cabinet members will attend today's meeting, and it's very likely that the meeting is happening right now as we speak. And that includes the outgoing Director of National Intelligence, Gabbard. All right, So basically, this meeting, obviously, I think there are two main things to watch for regarding the Iran deal. Let me share them with you. First, it's clear that Iran will agree not to develop its nuclear program and maybe even hand over its nuclear waste. But the problem is, what if they just pay lip service and don't actually stop their actions? So before that meeting, Vice President Mans told NBC, the American National Broadcasting Company, that he was hopeful about the clause in the agreement where Iran promises not to develop nuclear weapons. But the hardest part is the supervision and enforcement clauses. So what Vance said is the same as what Feng Wei said, right? I've always said this. Signing is easy, but whether they actually follow through is another matter. For Iran's Shia religious regime, when faced with a major enemy, they'll sign anything. They can sign whatever now and deal with it later. That's always been their policy. As for the United States, Secretary of State Rubio said yesterday that President Trump wants to reach a deal, but only if it's a good one. Otherwise, he'd rather have no deal at all. To put it another way, if negotiations work out, great. But if not, the U.S. is ready to flip the table and start over, go back to confrontation. For the sake of this agreement, President Trump specifically called Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday, asking the Israeli military not to attack Hezbollah in Lebanon right now. The Israeli army had struck over 100 locations just the day before. Why is that? It's so as not to disrupt the crucial U.S.-Iran negotiations happening right now. So when it comes to peace talks with Iran, Trump really takes it very seriously. According to a recent report by the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. Navy has already resumed what's called the Freedom Project, the freedom of navigation operations. They were supposed to provide escort for commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz, but right after that, the U.S. Central Command issued a statement to refute the claim, saying that it wasn't true. The so-called Freedom Project hasn't been resumed, and the U.S. is not currently escorting commercial ships. I've mentioned this before. If any of our attentive viewers remember, when they withdrew the Freedom Project, it only lasted for 3 days, right? Or maybe just 2.5 days. Yeah, even a day and a half. I said back then that it might not be resumed. And sure enough, it still hasn't been, because when they withdrew, they dismantled all the related facilities. Anyway, whatever the case, what's the reason? I still don't think it's clear. Obviously, escorting ships is a very demanding and high-risk task. During that day and a half of escorting, the U.S. military had to confront the Iranian-backed fleet of small boats, and at the time, they sank about 5 or 6 of them, right? We all remember that. But anyway, this wasn't something that started lightly. There are just too few U.S. warships and too many merchant ships. Right now, there are 1,500 ships in the Persian Gulf that need to get out, and outside, there could be hundreds more waiting to go in. The U.S. only has 3 to 5 warships in total, so this whole thing is actually a really tough job. Now, is this the reason why the so-called Freedom Project was stopped? I don't know. But anyway, now it's about peace talks. If they can reach an agreement, of course there'd be no need to go through all this trouble. At the moment, the U.S. military is still maintaining a maritime blockade outside the Persian Gulf, specifically in the waters outside the Strait of Hormuz. So far, at least 108 ships have been ordered to turn back and denied entry, whether they're coming in or going out. All right, next let's talk about the Texas primary. The Texas primary. Wow, of course Trump was expected to win, but the question was by how much? He managed to defeat the incumbent Texas Senator, Cornyn. Okay, let me tell you the election results first. Cornyn's opponent was the current Texas Attorney General, or also known as the State Attorney General, Paxton. He defeated the 4-term incumbent senior U.S. Senator John Cornyn by a margin of 64 to 36. So he led by more than 27%, not a close match. It was 64 to 36. This victory not only ended Cornyn's tenure in the Senate since 2003, but more importantly, it once again proved just how influential Trump is within the Republican Party. This election was actually the most expensive primary in Texas history. Both sides spent a total of $120 million. You know, back in the 1990s, it only cost about $10 million to run for a Senate seat. I remember that very clearly because I had just arrived in the U.S. at that time. Well, not exactly when I first got to the U.S., but in the early 2000s, it cost about $10 million to run in a federal Senate primary. So now it's gone up to $127 million, and that's just for the primary. But the key isn't just the total amount. When it comes to fundraising between Cornyn and Paxton, we're talking about individual private donations. Cornyn raised 3 times as much as Paxton. Then, if you look at outside funding, support from independent PACs, independent political action committees, the ratio's 9 to 1. And then the Republican Senate Committee contributed $13 million. So that's $13 million to 0. So even though out of that $127 million, $111 million went to Cornyn's opponent, Paxton only got $16 million. So the comparison is almost 10 to 1. As a result, both sides were tied in the polls about a week ago, but after Trump endorsed Paxton, Trump praised Paxton as a true MAGA warrior. He said Cornyn was a good man in tough times, but didn't support him enough when it mattered. Okay, so actually, Cornyn never impeached Trump. However, when it came to Trump's legal cases or his stance on the election, Cornyn would raise questions, but in the end, he still voted to support Trump. But Trump felt that this still wasn't enough, that Cornyn's support wasn't strong enough. As for Paxton, he has always been very supportive of Trump. For example, after the 2020 election, he joined with more than 20 states to bring a case to the Supreme Court regarding this so-called about Trump's loss in the election. They filed a lawsuit. That's what it's called. So that's how things have always been. After Trump made these 2 statements, well, not just 2 statements, he actually wrote a post. He basically expressed 2 points. First, I fully support Paxton without reservation. Second, Cornyn is a good guy, but he hasn't supported me enough. That was the decisive blow. The two sides were basically tied in the polls, both around 40% and 41%, but after that, it turned into 64 to 34. So basically, with just one statement, Trump decided the outcome. So Paxton said that since he got involved in politics, he had never seen a more influential endorsement than this. In other words, Trump's endorsement is the golden standard, the gold rule, the gold benchmark. Whoever he endorses gets the position. So at least so far this time, Trump has endorsed 3 federal House representatives, and all of them have won. They won in the primaries. So up until now, Trump has basically managed to replace 3 Republican federal senators in the primaries. The first one is Tom Taylor from North Carolina. As you can see, Tom Taylor didn't actually lose the election. Basically, because he voted in favor of impeaching Trump back then, he just stepped down on his own and didn't run for re-election. As you know, if you're a senator, especially if you're not that old, getting re-elected is almost always a sure thing with very little suspense. So basically, when someone bows out halfway through like that, you know there's no way they'd win if they ran. Second, there's Louisiana. We've already talked about Bill Cassidy. He was also replaced because of Trump's endorsement of his opponent. Third is John Cornyn, who we're talking about today. So the first 2 were both senators who voted to impeach Trump. As you know, senators usually aren't replaced. Why? Because the party typically won't swap out their senator from a given state. First, there's the advantage of being in office, more accurately called the incumbent advantage. It's much easier to win, and you don't have to spend a lot on campaign expenses. If you run a new election, you really have to pour a lot of money into it. Second, as a senator, they've built up deep connections in the community. So if you try to replace them easily, it turns into a big deal. For example, Tom Tillis has been in office for 12 years, Bill Cassidy for 12 years, and John Cornyn for 24 years. During Trump's, what was it called again? Under Trump's decision, they were all replaced. Another very noteworthy case, which I've already reported to you all, is Kentucky's congressman, the libertarian Thomas Massie. So all these people originally had a long-term advantage in their own districts and were sure to win, but Trump alone could turn things around and take him down. So what are the consequences if things keep going this way? First, the Senate will increasingly become what's called Trump's army. That's the first point. Second, these senators who get taken down halfway through might turn into some kind of resistance figures or even join a resistance movement. What does that mean? Because their terms don't end until January next year. They're not replaced until January 3rd, right? So during this period, if they don't cooperate with Trump, it could cause losses for him. Of course, you might ask, what kind of losses are we talking about? Well, to put it this way. To put it more bluntly, you could say that Trump won't be able to get anything passed, at least until January next year. Not a single controversial bill will get through. Actually, the most controversial bill is just one, the Annual Reconciliation Act. This Reconciliation Act is like a big basket. You can put all sorts of things in it. It only needs a simple majority in the Senate to pass, and it doesn't have to face a filibuster. So the recent $1.8 billion so-called Anti-Weaponization Act, which is an appropriations bill aimed at countering weaponization, was stuffed into this Reconciliation Act. As you all know, this caused a stir within the Republican Party. All right, so basically after that, they just went on break and stopped working. Oh man. But let me clarify something for everyone, or rather let me correct myself. The $1.8 billion in reconciliation funds has already been allocated. The Department of Justice has already dispersed the $1.8 billion, and Trump has appointed 5 people to form what's called a decision committee. They've already started the compensation process. This includes people involved in January 6th, those who were, you could say, targeted by the Justice Department. Back then, the federal prosecutor did say they were going to enforce the law very strictly, basically what the CCP would call severe and harsh punishment. So it's true that some of the sentences handed down may very well have been excessive. In China, severe punishment is seen as reasonable, but in the US, that concept doesn't exist. The laws are clear. There's no such thing. If the US adopts it, they're straying from their own principles. All right, anyway, the $1.8 billion has already been dispersed. So if the $1.8 billion has already been dispersed, why do they still need Republican lawmakers to pass it in the reconciliation bill? It's just to give it more legal backing. Because according to traditional American constitutional principles, it's Congress that appropriates the money. right? The federal government just spends the money, but as for how it's spent, that's supposed to be determined by Congress's rules. You can't just decide on your own how to spend it. Now you've already dispersed $1.8 billion, and you set up a 5-person committee, and you can give the money to whoever you want. That's exactly the controversy here. But let me back up a bit. This is actually pretty interesting. There's a big moral principle at play here. Do you know how Trump got that $1.8 billion? First, he claimed that his tax returns were illegally leaked, which caused him huge losses. So he sued the IRS. This happened just a couple of months ago. He sued the IRS for $10 billion. $10 billion. When people heard about it, they were like, what's going on? The president is suing the IRS? The president is suing his own government? Then Trump said, okay, 2 months later, I'll settle. I don't want the $10 billion anymore. In exchange, I'll make a deal with the IRS and the Department of Justice. The deal was, you have to come up with $1.8 billion from what's called the Judgment Fund as compensation for the people who were persecuted. In other words, Trump said, I was persecuted, but I don't want this money. But the condition for me not taking the money is that the Department of Justice also has to come up with $1.8 billion to compensate the ordinary people who were hunted down and persecuted. Okay, so about this matter, of course, like I mentioned to everyone yesterday, there's controversy. Our different viewers have given different opinions, but as for this issue, here's where things stand now. Even if the Republicans don't approve this payment, if it doesn't pass in the claims bill, is the Department of Justice's previous disbursement of this money illegal or unconstitutional? Actually, it's not illegal. Why? Because there is already a precedent. As you may know, back in 1999, Native American farmers in the U.S. filed a lawsuit against the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They sued the Department of Agriculture, claiming they were subjected to racial discrimination in loan and subsidy programs. This case dragged on for 12 years, and in 2011, during Obama's administration, a settlement was reached and the government paid compensation. So what happened? Originally, only a small number of people participated in the lawsuit. There were just a few plaintiffs. But then the Obama administration took the initiative to expand it, saying that any Native American farmer who felt they had been discriminated against could apply. So even if they hadn't participated in the lawsuit, in the end, there were 33,000 applicants. Some applicants weren't even farming anymore, but they could still receive tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in compensation. At the time, the settlement fund was set at $760 million, but in the end, the actual payout was much higher because more and more people came forward thinking, wow, the government is handing out money. That was the vibe. So at the time, this case was also heavily criticized by Republicans who believed it seriously violated the constitutional principle that Congress controls the purse strings. So this time, Republicans are again opposing Trump's approach. They see it as the executive branch just handed out money to its own political allies. And the review process was way too lax, making it really easy for fraud to happen, and it was almost impossible to catch anyone. So, as you know, these criticisms are exactly what I mentioned yesterday, Republicans' criticisms of Trump. What I mean is, the Democrats have already done this before. Now it's just the Republicans' turn to do the same thing. It's just like gerrymandering, just like redrawing electoral districts. Last year, Texas started redrawing its districts, and some people criticized Texas, saying the Republicans were out of line. How can you do something so unethical? But the thing is, the Democrats have been doing this for decades. The Republicans always looked down on it and refused to do it, until Trump said, an eye for an eye, fight fire with fire. In other words, he called on the Republicans to do it too, and that's why Texas started doing it. This issue is the same as what we just talked about, called the Anti-Weaponization Funding Act. So this is actually the same thing. That's why it's so interesting. There's also the Safe America Act, which is similar. It's about getting rid of the filibuster, right? If the Democrats were in power, they would definitely get rid of it. The Republicans, on the other hand, just refuse to do it. Why? Because they feel it's morally wrong. So John Thune made it very clear. If someone wants to steal the car, don't use my keys. What he means is, if one day the Democrats take control of Congress and want to get rid of the filibuster, they should do it themselves, not with our help. In other words, we Republicans won't do it. Do y'all get what that means? It's like, for certain things, whether it's about redrawing the map or what we just talked about, this so-called political quota, which is really a kind of political compensation. Plus, when it comes to the filibuster, the Democrats are willing to do it if it gives them a political advantage, but the Republicans won't, because they feel it's not morally right, it's not good. So what happened during Trump's time? Trump said the Republicans should do it too, but the Republicans themselves wouldn't go along. You know, the ones blocking him were always Republicans. Why? Because they were acting out of their own moral self-restraint, self-imposed restraint. So a few days ago, there was actually a viewer who wrote me a message. I was really moved by it and have been meaning to reply, but I forgot who it was. The gist of it was, he said, "Feng-Wei, you shouldn't criticize Thomas Massie. I really admire him. He has great morals. You just don't understand him." Well, my response is, I think I do understand him because he saw that he kept voting against many of Trump's bills. The reason is that he saw things in Trump's bills that didn't align with his own moral principles. He just votes no, regardless of whether the outcome is good for the country or not. But he says, I have to stick to my own morals as an American citizen. What do you think about this kind of thing? How do you view Thomas? What's his name, Macy? It's honestly a really interesting topic. To be honest, I really can't blame him, right? Because he's just making decisions based on his own morals, isn't he? But Confucius once said something. When in poverty, one should focus on self-cultivation, right? But when in prosperity, one should help the world. If you care so much about your own personal cultivation, then why run for Congress? Just be a regular citizen, stick to your moral principles, and set an example for everyone. Be a role model. That's great. So why bother running for Congress? You're just wasting a vote there, maybe even casting your vote for the wrong side. Isn't it the case that, as a member of Congress, he's just sticking to his own personal morals and ignoring the needs of the country? Isn't this a kind of moral dilemma, a real ethical predicament? So, what do you all think should be done? Simply put, I want to start something here called a public discourse, a public debate. Let's do a poll. Do you agree with Trump's tough approach of fight fire with fire? Originally, I wouldn't have done this, but because you did it and it led to political bias, then I'll do it too. So, do you support this approach or do you support Thomas Massie, who insists on not doing it no matter what the consequences are, because he wants to make sure that what he personally does is always right? How about we do a poll? Do you support or oppose Trump's tough approach? I really want to know what everyone thinks. Very interesting. That's just how it is. It's a dilemma. I've already mentioned 3 things: drawing the map, this compensation, and then there's the rate buster situation, things like that, and this kind of test. During Trump's administration, situations like this kept coming up. Why? Because now it's a showdown between the two parties. Neither side has a clear advantage. Neither side is guaranteed to win. But then, what do you do when the country or its policies need to move forward? Okay, all right, so now, yesterday, Trump had a huge victory. And not only did he win big, but if you look at it, Trump has now won 118 elections so far. That is, in the Republican primaries, Trump has endorsed 9 senators, 101 in the House of Representatives, and 8 governors, all victories. In American history, as far as I know, there has never been such an achievement. So you can really see that the Republican Party is rallying behind Trump. Now, you could basically call the Republican Party the Trump Republican Party. It's really like that. So now the third-party critics are saying that you can win the Republican Party. Are you going to lose the midterms and then lose the general election too? Because after Paxton won, he would go up against the Democratic candidate named James Tallarico. Right now, in the head-to-head polls, he's trailing. That's why. The Republican Senate leader, John Thune, is really unhappy. What's so great about beating Cornyn? If you lose the general election, it's just like losing the midterms. Wouldn't that all be for nothing? Cornyn is a moderate, and if he were up against Tallarico, he would definitely win. Now that you've pushed him out, what if you end up losing yourself? So yeah, that's definitely a worry. Isn't that interesting? This is another moral test, right? It's really fascinating. As you all know, in the last midterm elections in 2022, Trump was really something. He endorsed a lot of people, but in the end, they all lost in the general election. In the end, they only won in 2 places. Vance won and got into the Senate. And then in the House, they won just enough to get a slight majority, flipping it so that Johnson could take the position. But back then, it wasn't Johnson yet. Who was it at the time? It was McCarthy, right? But all the other people he backed lost. So everyone remembers, right? That time was really rough for Trump. Honestly, that was rock bottom. That's why back then, the governor of Texas, DeSantis, stepped up to challenge Trump. Do you all remember? But it didn't work out, right? He almost ruined his own reputation within the Republican Party. So just because you win the Republican primary doesn't mean you'll definitely win the general election, but it also doesn't mean you'll definitely lose. There are a lot of variables here. So you see, for Cornyn, it's all about strategy, right? He doesn't care about principles. If Cornyn has a better chance of winning, we'll pick Cornyn. But Trump doesn't care about that. In this sense, Trump is actually more about principles. The one who sticks to his principles the most is Paxton. Let him go all the way. Whether he can make it or not, I hope he does. That's what I mean. So there are actually a lot of factors at play here. Who will win in the end? Of course, it's hard to say. There are a lot of variables, but actually, there's one variable. Have you ever thought about it? Or does anyone agree? The variable I'm talking about is whether fate will let him win. I'm not saying this to sound mystical. Remember, back when DeSantis finished the 2022 primary, he won big in Florida by more than 10 points, and he was young and promising. His policies and everything else looked really impressive. Then he couldn't hold back and decided to run for president, going head to head with Trump. Then he relied on Musk to back him, DeSantis, the world's richest man, supporting DeSantis. The two of them did a campaign launch conversation on X. Wow, the amount of traffic was huge. It was like a dazzling debut. But then the system crashed, remember? The two of them only managed to say a few words at the beginning and then nothing. The whole thing, for dozens of minutes, there was no traffic coming in. At that moment, I had just one thought in my head. It's like fate doesn't want him to be president right now. It kind of felt like that, you know? Well, anyway, whatever the case, you could really see from this that Trump, he and this, unlike other Republicans, he's different. He's been through all these elections and has always stuck to his original intentions. I've talked to you all about his views before, back in the 2016 election, right? After he won the primaries, one of my American friends, an expert, told me that he would change his stance during the general election, become more moderate. But he didn't change at all. So Trump has been the same from start to finish, never changed. So is that smart or is it asterisk? I don't know what you all think. You can leave a comment. So Trump pushes forward no matter the cost or the consequences. My personal opinion, well, it's just my own view. I think Trump's kind of persistence might lead to setbacks in the short term, but in the long run, he could win over the whole heart of America. That's what I believe. It's like watching a friend struggle, but keep pushing. You respect that. If their actions prove right in the end, you're genuinely convinced. That's my take. I could be wrong, and it's fine to disagree. Everyone has their own view. What do you think of Trump's approach?